For 30 years, a killer walked free, taunting police with messages scrawled on barn doors, leaving behind disturbing evidence in public places, and openly boasting about murdering an 8-year-old girl. He threatened to kill again. He laughed at investigators, and for 3 decades, he got away with it. Until one detective refused to give up, and cutting-edge DNA technology finally brought a monster to justice. This is the story of April Tinsley, a little girl whose murder shocked a community and whose case would eventually change the way cold cases are solved forever. Before we dive deep into this haunting investigation, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe that no case should ever go unsolved and that justice matters no matter how much time has passed, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. We cover the most compelling cold cases from across the country, and your support helps us keep these stories alive. Now, let's begin. It was Good Friday, April 1st, 1988. The spring air in Fort Wayne, Indiana, carried that particular freshness that comes after a long winter, when the world seems to be waking up again. Trees were beginning to bud, flowers were pushing through the soil, children were playing outside, enjoying the long holiday weekend ahead of them. In the Waynedale neighborhood, a quiet residential area on the southwest side of Fort Wayne, life moved at the gentle pace that defined small-town America in the late 80s. April Marie Tinsley was 8 years old. She had blonde hair, bright eyes, and a smile that could light up any room she walked into. She was in 2nd grade at Fairfield Elementary School, where her teachers described her as a sweet, cheerful child who loved learning and playing with her friends. April was also a member of her church's children's choir, and her voice, though small, carried a pure quality that made everyone who heard her sing pause and listen. She lived with her mother, Janet Tinsley, and her siblings in a modest home in the Waynedale neighborhood. Like most 8-year-olds, April loved spending time with her friends, riding bikes, playing games, and simply being a kid. That Friday afternoon, April was doing exactly what any normal child would do on a beautiful spring day. She was playing with 2 of her friends, moving between their houses in the neighborhood. The girls were having fun, laughing, playing, enjoying the freedom that comes with being young and carefree. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, April told her friends she needed to go back to one of their houses to retrieve her umbrella. It was a simple errand, the kind of thing kids do 100 times without anyone thinking twice about it. April said goodbye to her friends and started walking back. She never made it home. When dinner time came and April hadn't returned, Janet Tinsley immediately knew something was wrong. April was a good kid, responsible for her age. She always came home when she was supposed to. She always let her mother know where she was going. The fact that she hadn't come home, hadn't called, hadn't shown up at all, sent a cold wave of fear through Janet's body. She called April's friends. She called their parents. She walked through the neighborhood calling April's name, knocking on doors, asking everyone she saw if they had seen her daughter. No one had seen April since around 3 o'clock that afternoon. Janet called the police. Within minutes, patrol cars were rolling into the Waynedale neighborhood, their lights flashing against the darkening sky. Officers fanned out across the area, knocking on every door, checking every yard, every alley, every possible place where an 8-year-old girl might be. Neighbors joined the search. Volunteers came from all over Fort Wayne. By nightfall, more than 250 Fort Wayne police officers and 50 volunteers were searching for April. They searched through the night. They searched through the next day. They searched through Easter Sunday. Helicopters flew overhead. Search dogs tracked scents through yards and fields. Officers went door to door, questioning residents, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual, any strange cars, any suspicious behavior. The entire community was mobilized, united in the desperate hope that April would be found safe. But as the hours turned into days, that hope began to fade. On Monday, April 4th, 3 days after April disappeared, a jogger was running along a rural road near Spenceville, Indiana, about 20 miles north of Fort Wayne. It was a quiet area, farmland mostly, with long stretches of empty road bordered by ditches and fields. As the jogger ran past one particular section of road, something caught his eye, something that didn't belong there, something that made him stop running and look closer. In the ditch beside the road, partially hidden by grass and debris, was the body of a small child. The jogger immediately called the police. Within the hour, the area was swarmed by investigators, forensic teams, and officers from multiple jurisdictions. The body was quickly identified as April Marie Tinsley. She was still wearing the clothes she had been wearing when she disappeared 3 days earlier. An autopsy would later determine that April had died from asphyxiation. There were also clear indications of sexual assault. The medical examiner estimated that April had been killed shortly after her abduction on Good Friday. The news devastated Fort Wayne. Parents who had been holding on to hope that April would be found alive now had to face the horrific reality that a monster had taken her, assaulted her, and murdered her. Janet Tinsley, who had spent 3 days in agonizing limbo, now had to confront the worst nightmare any parent could ever experience. Her little girl, her beautiful, innocent 8-year-old daughter, was gone forever. The investigation shifted from a missing child case to a homicide investigation. Every resource available was poured into finding April's killer. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people. They followed up on every tip, every lead, every piece of information that came in. A witness reported seeing a white man, approximately in his 30s, forcing a young girl who matched April's description into a blue pickup truck on the day she disappeared. Police worked with sketch artists to create a composite drawing of the suspect. The sketch was distributed throughout the region, posted in newspapers, shown on television news broadcasts, displayed on bulletin boards in every public place imaginable. Forensic examination of April's clothing revealed crucial evidence. DNA from an unknown male was found on April's underwear. This was 1988, and while DNA technology existed, it was still relatively new and limited in its applications. The DNA profile could be preserved and documented, but without a suspect to compare it to, it couldn't identify the killer. Detectives entered the DNA profile into their records, hoping that someday, somehow, it would lead them to the person responsible. But as weeks turned into months and months turned into years, no match was found, no suspect was arrested. Despite the massive investigation, despite the hundreds of interviews and thousands of hours of detective work, April's killer remained unidentified. The case went cold. For Janet Tinsley and April's family, life became an unbearable mixture of grief and frustration. They had lost April, and the person who took her from them was still out there, walking free, living a normal life while they suffered every single day. The family held memorial services. They kept April's memory alive through photographs and stories. They never stopped hoping that someday justice would come. Then, 2 years after April's murder, something happened that sent shockwaves through the investigation and proved that the killer was not only still out there, but was actively taunting the police. In May of 1990, 2 full years after April's death, someone made a disturbing discovery in Graybill, Indiana, a small town not far from where April's body had been found. On the side of a barn, scrawled in what appeared to be crayon or pencil, was a message. The handwriting was crude, almost childish, but the words were chilling. The message read, I kill 8-year-old April M. Tinsley. Did you find her other shoe? Ha ha, I will kill again. Police were immediately called to the scene. Forensic teams photographed the message. Handwriting analysts studied it. Psychologists were brought in to create a profile of the person who would write such a thing. The message was clearly from April's killer. He was taunting the police, mocking them for their inability to catch him. The misspelling of again as again, the casual mention of April's other shoe, which indeed had been missing when her body was found, the laughing ha-ha at the end, all of it pointed to someone who felt completely confident that he would never be caught. The reference to killing again was particularly terrifying. Was this just empty bragging, or did the killer genuinely intend to strike again? Police increased patrols in the area. Parents became even more vigilant about their children's safety. The entire community was on edge, wondering if and when this monster would act again. But years passed, and no similar crimes occurred. The barn door message remained the only communication from the killer. Investigators continued working the case, but with no new leads and no way to identify the person who had written the message, they had nowhere to go. The case went cold. Then, 14 years later, in 2004, 16 years after April's murder, the killer surfaced again, and this time his actions were even more disturbing. In the summer of 2004, residents of Fort Wayne began finding strange packages in public places around the city. The packages were plastic bags, the kind you might use for groceries or trash. Inside the bags were used condoms and handwritten notes. The notes contained explicit, graphic descriptions of what the writer had done to April Tinsley. The notes made it clear that the person who left them was claiming responsibility for April's rape and murder. Detectives collected the packages and immediately sent the condoms for DNA testing. The results came back positive. The DNA from the condoms matched the DNA profile that had been collected from April's underwear in 1988. This was not a hoax. This was not someone seeking attention by falsely claiming to be the killer. This was the real killer, and he was still out there, still taunting the police, still getting away with murder. Over the next few months, more packages were found. Each one contained used condoms and notes with similar content. That same day, detectives approached Miller at his mobile home. They identified themselves and asked if they could speak with him. Miller agreed. They didn't immediately arrest him or tell him why they wanted to talk. They simply asked if he would come down to the station to answer some questions. Miller, perhaps believing he could talk his way out of whatever they suspected, agreed to come voluntarily. At the police station, detectives sat down with Miller in an interview room. They started with a simple question, a question that would reveal whether Miller knew exactly why they were there. They asked him, "Do you know why we want to talk to you?" Miller's response was immediate. He said, "April Tinsley." Those two words confirmed everything. Miller knew. He had known for 30 years that someday this moment might come, and now it had. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment saying "Justice for April." Let's see who's truly committed to remembering victims like her and supporting the detectives who never give up. Over the next several hours, John Miller confessed to the murder of April Tinsley. The confession was detailed, methodical, and utterly chilling. Miller told detectives that on Good Friday, April 1st, 1988, he had driven to the Waynedale neighborhood with the specific intention of kidnapping a child. He said he hadn't targeted April specifically. She was simply a child who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He saw her walking alone, he stopped his vehicle, and he convinced her to get into his car. The exact details of how he lured her in were not fully disclosed to the public, but it was clear that April, being a trusting 8-year-old child, had no reason to suspect that the man offering her a ride was a predator. Miller drove April to his trailer home. Once inside, he sexually assaulted her. During the assault, April began crying and said she was going to tell her mother what had happened. Miller, faced with the possibility of being identified and arrested, made the decision to kill her. He strangled April to death with his bare hands, choking the life out of an 8-year-old girl to save himself from the consequences of his actions. After April was dead, Miller wrapped her body and drove to the rural area near Spencerville, where she would later be found. He dumped her body in the ditch and drove away. Then he went back to his life, living in Graybill, working, existing in the same community, knowing that he had murdered a child and gotten away with it. Miller's confession also addressed the barn door message and the packages left around Fort Wayne. He admitted to writing the message on the barn in 1990. He said he had done it because he wanted to taunt the police, to show them that he was still out there and they couldn't catch him. The packages left in 2004 served the same purpose. Miller got a thrill from leaving evidence in public places, from knowing that he could essentially waive his guilt in front of investigators and still remain free. When detectives asked Miller why he had confessed so readily once they identified him, why he hadn't tried to deny everything or lawyer up immediately, Miller gave a chilling response. He said he had always known that eventually the technology would catch up to him. He knew his DNA was on file. He knew that someday, somehow, science would advance to the point where they could identify him. When the detectives showed up at his door, he realized that day had finally come. John D. Miller was formally arrested and charged with murder, child molestation, and criminal confinement. The news of his arrest spread quickly through Fort Wayne and across the country. For the Tinsley family, it was a moment of overwhelming emotion. Janet Tinsley, who had waited 30 years for this day, told reporters that she felt numb. She said she couldn't believe it was finally happening, that after all this time, the person who had murdered her daughter was finally in custody. Miller initially entered a plea of not guilty, which meant the case would go to trial. The prospect of a trial was both hopeful and terrifying for April's family. On one hand, it would mean a public airing of all the evidence, a full accounting of what had happened to April. On the other hand, it would mean reliving the worst moments of their lives in a courtroom, hearing graphic details about April's final hours, seeing the man who had murdered her sitting just a few feet away. But before the trial could begin, something changed. On December 7, 2018, John Miller changed his plea to guilty. He admitted in court that he had abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered April Tinsley. By pleading guilty, Miller avoided a trial, which also meant that April's family would be spared the ordeal of sitting through weeks of testimony. However, it also meant that some questions might never be fully answered. The sentencing hearing took place shortly after Miller's guilty plea. The courtroom was packed with April's family members, friends, community members, and media representatives. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the moment when April's killer would finally face justice. Before the sentence was handed down, several of April's family members read victim impact statements. These statements gave them the opportunity to speak directly to Miller, to tell him about the pain he had caused, about the life he had stolen, about the decades of suffering he had inflicted on everyone who loved April. April's cousin, Christina Snyder, stood before the court and addressed Miller directly. She told him that she used the word human loosely when describing him. She said that what he had done was beyond comprehension, that no normal human being could do what he had done to an innocent child. Other family members spoke about April's life, about the bright, cheerful little girl she had been, about all the milestones she would never reach, about the hole her death had left in their lives. Janet Tinsley also spoke. As April's mother, her words carried a weight that was almost unbearable to witness. She described the last 30 years of her life, the endless waiting, the constant wondering if the person who killed her daughter would ever be caught. She talked about the packages that had been left around Fort Wayne, how each new discovery had reopened the wound, how knowing that her daughter's killer was out there, living freely, had been a special kind of torture. She told Miller that she had feared this day would never come, that she had started to believe he would never be caught. The judge listened to all the victim impact statements. Then it was time for sentencing. Under Indiana law, John D. Miller faced serious prison time for his crimes. The judge sentenced John D. Miller to a total of 80 years in prison. He received 50 years for the murder charge and 30 years for the child molestation charge. Given Miller's age, 59 at the time of sentencing, an 80-year sentence was effectively a life sentence. Miller would die in prison. As the sentence was read, there was a sense of relief in the courtroom, but also a profound sadness. Justice had been served, but it had come 30 years too late. April Tinsley was still gone. She would never come back. No sentence, no matter how long, could undo what had been done to her. The April Tinsley case became a landmark in the use of forensic genetic genealogy to solve cold cases. It was one of the first major cases after the Golden State Killer arrest to demonstrate the power of this new investigative technique. Since Miller's arrest, dozens of other cold cases have been solved using forensic genetic genealogy. Killers who thought they had gotten away with murder, who had lived for decades without fear of being caught, suddenly found themselves in handcuffs as science caught up with them. Detective Brian Martin's decision to pursue genetic genealogy testing in April's case was praised by law enforcement officials across the country. Martin had recognized the potential of the technology and had acted quickly to apply it to April's case. His persistence and willingness to try new approaches had finally brought justice for April and her family. The case also sparked important conversations about privacy, DNA databases, and the use of genetic information in criminal investigations. Some privacy advocates raised concerns about the use of public genealogy databases for law enforcement purposes, arguing that people who submit their DNA to these databases to learn about their ancestry don't necessarily expect that information to be used to investigate their relatives. However, supporters of the technique argued that solving violent crimes and bringing dangerous criminals to justice outweighed these privacy concerns, especially since the databases being used were public and voluntary. For the Fort Wayne community, Miller's arrest and conviction brought a sense of closure to a case that had haunted them for 30 decades. Parents who had been children themselves when April was murdered, who had grown up with her story as a cautionary tale, could finally tell their own children that the person responsible had been caught. The case had been a dark shadow over the community for so long that its resolution felt like a collective exhale. But for those who knew April personally, who loved her and missed her every day, the resolution of the case was bittersweet. Yes, her killer had finally been caught. Yes, justice had been served. But April was still gone. She would have been 38 years old in 2018. She might have been married, might have had children of her own. She might have been a teacher, a nurse, an artist, anything she dreamed of being. Instead, her life was cut short at 8 years old, and all that remained of her were memories and photographs. The question that haunted many people was how John Miller had managed to avoid detection for so long. He had lived in Graybill, just miles from where April's body was found, for all those years. He had left taunting messages. He had deposited packages containing his DNA in public places. And yet, until genetic genealogy came along, there had been no way to connect him to the crime. It spoke to both the limitations of older investigative techniques and the importance of preserving evidence. If the DNA from April's case had not been carefully preserved back in 1988, if investigators had not maintained the evidence properly over 30 years, Miller might never have been caught. Miller's background revealed some disturbing details. He had no prior criminal record for sexual offenses or violence. He had lived what appeared to be a relatively normal life, working various jobs, living in his mobile home, interacting with neighbors and coworkers. No one who knew him suspected he was capable of such horrific violence. This is often the case with perpetrators of these kinds of crimes. They blend in. They appear normal. They don't fit the stereotypical image of a monster, and that's precisely what makes them so dangerous. After Miller's sentencing, investigators reviewed other unsolved cases in the area to see if Miller might be connected to additional crimes. The message he had left on the barn door, where he threatened to kill again, suggested that he might have had intentions to commit other crimes, or possibly already had. However, no definite links to other cases were established. It's possible that April's murder frightened Miller enough that he never acted on his impulses again, though he clearly never felt enough remorse to turn himself in or stop taunting the police. The technology that finally caught Miller, forensic genetic genealogy, continues to evolve and improve. As more people submit their DNA to genealogy databases, the technique becomes more powerful and more likely to generate leads in cold cases. Law enforcement agencies across the country are now routinely using genetic genealogy to investigate unsolved murders and sexual assaults. Cases that had been cold for 20, 30, even 40 years are suddenly being solved. Families who had given up hope of ever getting answers are receiving phone calls from detectives telling them that an arrest has been made. The April Tinsley case demonstrated that no matter how much time passes, justice is still possible. It showed that advances in technology can breathe new life into old investigations, and it proved that dedicated investigators who refuse to give up can make a difference even decades after a crime was committed. For law enforcement, the case served as a powerful reminder of the importance of evidence preservation. The DNA collected from April's clothing in 1988 had been carefully scored and maintained for 30 years. If that evidence had been lost, contaminated, or improperly stored, Miller would never have been caught. The case underscored the need for proper evidence handling and storage protocols, even in cases that seem unlikely to be solved. The case also highlighted the importance of maintaining public genealogy databases. While privacy concerns are valid and deserve consideration, the databases have proven to be invaluable tools for solving serious violent crimes. The people who submit their DNA to these databases are often unknowingly helping to bring murderers and rapists to justice. In many ways, they are contributing to public safety and helping families find closure. April's story became a teaching tool for child safety. While it's impossible to protect children from every danger, April's case reminded parents and educators of the importance of teaching children about stranger danger, about not accepting rides from people they don't know, about the reality that not every adult can be trusted. These are difficult conversations to have with young children, but they are necessary ones. In the years since Miller's conviction, April's family has worked to keep her memory alive in positive ways. They have established memorials, participated in events for missing and exploited children, and advocated for the continued use of genetic genealogy in solving cold cases. They have turned their pain into purpose, using April's story to help others and to ensure that she is remembered not just as a victim, but as a real person who was loved and cherished.
The community of Fort Wayne also found ways to honor April's memory. A memorial was established in her name. Local schools incorporated age-appropriate discussions about child safety into their curricula, using April's case as an example of why these lessons matter. The case became part of the community's history, a tragic reminder of the need for vigilance and the importance of never giving up on justice. For the investigators who worked on April's case over the years, Miller's conviction was a moment of professional validation, but also deep sadness. Many of the original investigators had retired or passed away by the time Miller was arrested. They had worked the case with dedication and determination, but the technology needed to solve it simply didn't exist during their time. The newer generation of investigators, including Detective Brian Martin, stood on the shoulders of those earlier investigators, using the evidence they had collected and preserved to finally bring the case to a close. The judge who sentenced Miller made a point of addressing April's family directly during the sentencing hearing. He acknowledged their decades of suffering, their patience, their unwavering commitment to finding justice for April. He told them that while nothing could bring April back, he hoped that Miller's conviction and imprisonment would provide some measure of peace. He praised their strength and resilience, noting that many families in similar situations might have given up hope long ago. Miller himself showed little emotion throughout the legal proceedings. He did not apologize to April's family. He did not express remorse for what he had done. He simply accepted his sentence and was led away to begin serving his 80 years in prison. His lack of emotion, his apparent indifference to the suffering he had caused, only reinforced the sense that he was exactly what April's cousin had called him, someone who could barely be described as human. The media coverage of Miller's arrest and conviction was extensive. National news outlets picked up the story, and it was featured on numerous true crime television shows and podcasts. The case became an example of how modern forensic techniques are revolutionizing criminal investigations. Experts in genetic genealogy were interviewed, explaining how the process works and discussing its potential for solving other cold cases. The story resonated with people across the country because it represented hope, the hope that even the oldest, coldest cases could still be solved, that justice could still be achieved. In the years since Miller's conviction, several other aspects of the case have been examined and discussed. Criminologists and psychologists have studied Miller's behavior, trying to understand what motivated him to not only commit the murder, but to taunt police for years afterward. Some experts believe that Miller's taunting behavior indicated a narcissistic personality, someone who derived pleasure from believing he was smarter than law enforcement. Others suggest that the taunting was a form of reliving the crime, a way for Miller to maintain the excitement and power he had felt during the murder. The fact that Miller claimed he had planned to kidnap a child that day, though he said he hadn't specifically targeted April, raised questions about whether there might have been other victims or attempted victims that were never reported. Investigators looked into other solved cases involving children in the region during the years after April's murder, but no definitive connections were found. It's possible that April's murder satisfied whatever dark urges Miller had, or that the massive investigation and media attention frightened him away from committing additional crimes. It's also possible that there were other victims whose cases were never reported or never connected to Miller. The barn door message in Grable, written 2 years after April's murder, remains one of the most chilling aspects of the case. The fact that Miller returned to the area where he had disposed of April's body, that he took the time to write out a message mocking the police and threatening to kill again, demonstrated a level of arrogance and cruelty that was difficult to comprehend. The message had been photographed and preserved, and it became a key piece of evidence, not just in terms of the case itself, but in understanding who Miller was as a person.
The packages left in 2004, containing used condoms and explicit notes, served a similar purpose. Miller wasn't content to simply have gotten away with murder. He needed to rub it in the faces of the investigators. He needed to prove that he could leave his DNA in public places and still not be caught. This behavior, while providing investigators with valuable evidence, also made the case more disturbing. It suggested that Miller wasn't just a killer, but someone who enjoyed the psychological torture he was inflicting on April's family and the investigators working the case. For students of criminal justice and forensic science, the April Tinsley case became a case study in the power of evidence preservation and the importance of never closing a case just because leads have dried up. The case demonstrated that technology is always advancing, and what seems impossible to solve today might be easily solvable tomorrow. It reinforced the lesson that every piece of evidence matters, that everything should be collected, documented, and preserved properly, because you never know when it might become the key to solving a case. The case also became important in discussions about statute of limitations for serious crimes. In many jurisdictions, there is no statute of limitations for murder, which meant that even though 30 years had passed, Miller could still be prosecuted for April's murder. This is not the case for all crimes, and advocates for victims' rights have used cases like April's to argue that serious violent crimes should never be subject to statutes of limitations, because justice should not have an expiration date. April Marie Tinsley was born in 1979. She died in 1988. She lived for only 8 years, but her impact has lasted far longer. Her case changed how investigators approach cold cases. Her story has educated countless people about child safety. Her memory has been honored by a community that never forgot her. And her killer, who thought he had gotten away with murder, learned that eventually justice catches up with everyone. Today, when you walk through Fort Wayne, you can still find people who remember April. They remember the massive search in 1988. They remember the barn door message. They remember the packages. And they remember the day in 2018 when the news broke that April's killer had finally been caught. For those who lived through it, the case is more than just a story. It's a part of their history, a reminder of both the worst of human nature and the best, the dedication of investigators who never gave up, the strength of a family that endured 30 years of uncertainty, and the power of a community that refused to forget. The technology that caught John Miller continues to advance. Genetic genealogy is becoming more sophisticated, more precise, more powerful. More cases are being solved every year. More families are getting answers. More killers who thought they had escaped justice are finding out that they were wrong. And it all traces back, in part, to cases like April Tinsley's, cases that demonstrated what was possible and inspired investigators around the world to take another look at the cold cases gathering dust in their evidence rooms. For April's family, life after Miller's conviction has been about learning to live with a mixture of relief and ongoing grief. The relief comes from knowing that Miller is in prison, that he can never hurt anyone else, that he will die behind bars. The grief comes from the unchangeable reality that April is still gone, that 30 years of her life were stolen, that they missed out on watching her grow up, graduate, fall in love, start a family. Justice was served, but it cannot undo what was done. One of the most important lessons from April's case is that families of victims should never give up hope. For 30 years, Janet Tinsley held on to the belief that someday, somehow, her daughter's killer would be found. There were times when that hope seemed foolish, when it seemed like the case would never be solved, but she never stopped hoping, and eventually that hope was validated. Her persistence, her willingness to continue cooperating with investigators even after decades had passed, her willingness to allow the case to remain in the public eye, all of these things contributed to the eventual solution.
Detective Martin's role in solving the case cannot be overstated. He could have looked at April's case and decided it was too old, too cold, too unlikely to be solved. He could have focused his attention on newer cases with fresher leads. But he didn't. He saw the potential in forensic genetic genealogy, and he acted on it.
He reached out to Parabon Nanolabs. He pushed for the testing to be done. He followed through on every step of the process. And when the results came back pointing to John Miller, he conducted a thorough investigation to confirm the match before making an arrest. His professionalism, his dedication, and his willingness to embrace new technology made all the difference. The collaboration between different law enforcement agencies and private companies was also crucial to solving April's case. The Fort Wayne Police Department worked with the FBI, with forensic labs, with Parabon Nanolabs, and with genetic genealogists. This kind of collaboration is becoming more common in law enforcement as agencies recognize that they can accomplish more by working together and utilizing specialized expertise than they can by working in isolation. Forensic genetic genealogy companies like Parabon Nanolabs have become important partners in solving cold cases. These companies employ genetic genealogists who have expertise in both DNA analysis and traditional genealogical research. They know how to navigate genetic databases, how to build family trees, how to narrow down lists of potential suspects. Their work is time-consuming and detail-oriented, but it has proven to be incredibly effective. As more people submit their DNA to public genealogy databases, the technique becomes more powerful and the chances of solving cold cases increase. There are ethical considerations that come with the use of forensic genetic genealogy. When someone submits their DNA to a public genealogy database, they may not realize that their genetic information could potentially be used by law enforcement to investigate crimes committed by their relatives. This raises questions about informed consent and privacy. However, most of the databases that are used for forensic genetic genealogy are explicitly public databases where users have agreed to make their information available to others. In many cases, the databases have policies that specifically allow for law enforcement use. And many people feel that the ability to solve serious violent crimes justifies the potential privacy concerns. The debate over these ethical issues is ongoing, and it's an important conversation to have. But from the perspective of April's family, the debate is simple. If forensic genetic genealogy had not been available, John Miller would still be free. He would still be living his life, enjoying his freedom, while April would still be gone, and her family would still be without answers. The technology gave them justice. It gave them closure. It allowed them to finally have some peace after 30 years of suffering. As the years go by, April's case will continue to be remembered and studied. New investigators will learn about it in training. New forensic scientists will study the DNA evidence. New genetic genealogists will examine how the family tree was constructed. The case has already had a lasting impact on criminal justice, and that impact will only grow as more cases are solved using similar techniques. For the people of Fort Wayne, April Tinsley will always be remembered. She was one of their own, a little girl who should have grown up in their community, who should have gone to their schools, who should have become a part of their town's future. Instead, she became a symbol, a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of protecting children. Her memory serves as a call to action, a reminder that communities must stay vigilant, that parents must teach their children about safety, that law enforcement must never give up on unsolved cases. The story of April Tinsley is a story of tragedy, but it is also a story of perseverance. It's a story about a family that never gave up hope. It's a story about investigators who never stopped working, even when the case seemed impossible to solve. It's a story about how technology can bring justice when human efforts alone fall short. And it's a story about a little girl whose life mattered, whose memory was honored, and whose killer was finally brought to justice. John D. Miller is now in his 60s, serving 80 years in an Indiana state prison. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars, a fitting end for someone who took the life of an innocent child. He will never again have the freedom to walk the streets of Grable or Fort Wayne. He will never again have the opportunity to hurt another child. He will die in prison, likely decades from now, and when he does, Hugh will mourn him. His legacy is one of cruelty, violence, and cowardice. April Marie Tinsley's legacy is very different. She is remembered with love. She is remembered as a victim who deserved justice and who finally received it. She is remembered as a little girl with a beautiful voice who sang in her church choir. She is remembered as a daughter, a sister, a friend. And she is remembered as the reason that countless investigators around the world have renewed their commitment to solving cold cases, inspired by the knowledge that even the most difficult cases can be solved if people refuse to give up. If you've made it this far in April's story, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen, to learn, and to remember. Cases like April's need to be told. The victims need to be remembered. The families need to know that people care. And the investigators who dedicate their lives to seeking justice need to know that their work matters. If this case has moved you, if you believe that every victim deserves justice, no matter how much time has passed, I encourage you to subscribe to Cold Case Reels right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you never miss another story. Share this video with others who care about true crime and cold cases. Leave a comment letting me know what you think about April's case and the use of genetic genealogy to solve cold cases. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people, and the more people who know about these cases, the more pressure there is to keep working on unsolved crimes. From all of us at Cold Case Reels, thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and thank you for being part of the community that believes in justice for all victims, no matter how long it takes. April Tinsley's case is solved. Her killer is in prison, but there are thousands of other cases still waiting for answers. Stay tuned, because we'll be covering more of those cases in future videos. Together, we can keep the memory of these victims alive and support the ongoing fight for justice. Case closed. Justice served. April Marie Tinsley, forever remembered.